Hey, what's up, everybody? We are on chapter 2 of The Witches. Chapter 2, My Grandmother. And like last video, we'll discuss after we read the chapter. My grandmother. I myself had two separate encounters with witches before I was 8 years old. From the first, I escaped unharmed, but on the second occasion, I was not so lucky. Things happen to me that will probably make you scream when you read about them. That can't be helped. The truth must be told. The fact that I'm still here and able to speak to you, however peculiar I may look, is due entirely to my wonderful grandmother. My grandmother was Norwegian. The Norwegians know all about witches, for Norway, with its black forests and icy mountains, is where the first witches came from. My father and my mother were also Norwegian, but because my father had a business in England, I had been born there, had lived there, and had started going to an English school. Twice a year at Christmas and in the summer, we went back to Norway to visit my grandmother. This old lady, as far as I could gather, was just about the only surviving relative we had on either side of our family. She was my mother's mother, and I absolutely adored her. When she and I were together, we spoke in either Norwegian or in English. It didn't matter which. We were equally fluent in both languages, and I have to admit that I felt closer to her than to my mother. Soon after my seventh birthday, my parents took me as usual to spend Christmas with my grandmother in Norway. And it was over there, while my father and mother and I were driving in icy weather just north of Oslo, that our car skidded off the road and went tumbling down into a rocky ravine. My parents were killed. I was firmly strapped into the back seat and received only a cut on the forehead. I won't go into the horrors of that terrible afternoon. I still get the shivers when I think about it. I finished up, of course, back at my grandmother's house with her arms around me tight and both of us crying the whole night long. "What are we going to do now?" I asked her through the tears. "You will stay here with me," she said, "and I will look after you." "Aren't I going back to England?" "No," she said, "I can never do that. Heaven shall take my soul, but Norway shall keep my bones." The very next day, in order that we might both try to forget our great sadness, my grandmother started telling me stories. She was a wonderful storyteller, and I was enthralled by everything she told me. But I didn't really become excited until she got on the subject of witches. She was apparently a great expert on these creatures, and she made it very clear to me that her witch stories, unlike most of the others, were not imaginary tales. They were all true. They were the gospel truth. They were history. Everything she was telling me about witches had actually happened, and I had better believe it. What was worse, what was far, far worse, was that witches were still with us. They were all around us, and I had better believe that too. "Are you really being truthful, Grandmama? Really and truly truthful?" "My darling," she said, "you won't last long in this world if you don't know how to spot a witch when you see one." "But you told me that witches look like ordinary women, Grandmama. So how can I spot them?" "Now, you must listen to me," my grandmother said. "You must remember everything I tell you. After all you can do is cross your heart and pray to heaven and hope for the best." We were in the big living room of her house in Oslo, and I was ready for bed. The curtains were never drawn in that house, and through the windows I could see huge snowflakes falling slowly onto an outside world that was as black as tar. My grandmother was tremendously old and wrinkled, with a massive, wide body, which was smothered in gray lace. She sat there majestic in her armchair, filling every inch of it. Not even a mouse could have squeezed in to sit beside her. I myself, just 7 years old, was crouched on the floor at her feet, wearing pajamas, dressing gown, and slippers. "You swear you aren't pulling my leg?" I kept saying to her. "You swear you aren't just pretending?" "Listen," she said, "I have known no less than 5 children who have simply vanished off the face of this earth, never to be seen again. The witches took them." "I still think you're just trying to frighten me," I said. "I'm trying to make sure you don't go the same way," she said. "I love you, and I want you to stay with me." "Tell me about the children who disappeared," I said. My grandmother was the only grandmother I ever met who smoked cigars. She lit one now, a long black cigar that smelled of burning rubber. "The first child I knew who disappeared," she said, "was called Ringhild Hansen. Now, Ringhild was about 8 at the time, and she was playing with her little sister on the lawn, and their mother, who was baking bread in the kitchen, came outside for a breath of air. 'Where's Ringhild?' she asked. 'She went away with the tall lady,' the little sister said. 'What tall lady?' the mother said. The tall lady in white gloves, the little sister said. She took Ragged by the hand and led her away. No one, my grandmother said, ever saw Ragged again. Did they search for her? I asked. Oh, they searched for miles around. Everyone in the town helped, but they never found her. What happened to the other four children? I asked. They vanished just as Ragged did. How, Grandmama? How did they vanish? Well, in every case, a strange lady was seen outside the house just before it happened. But how did they vanish? I asked. Well, the second one was very peculiar, my grandmother said. There was a family called Christensen. They lived up in Hollow and they had an old oil painting in the living room, which they were very proud of. The painting showed some ducks in the yard outside a farmhouse. There were no people in the painting, just a flock of ducks on a grassy farmyard, and the farmhouse in the background. It is a large painting and rather pretty. Well, one day their daughter Slovak came home from school eating an apple. She said a nice lady had given it to her on the street. The next morning, little Slovak was not in her bed. The parents searched everywhere, but they couldn't find her. Then all of a sudden, her father shouted, There she is! That's Slovak feeding the ducks! He was pointing at the oil painting, and sure enough, Slovak was in it. She was standing in the farmyard in the act of throwing bread to the ducks out of a basket. The father rushed to the painting and touched her, but that didn't help. She was simply a part of the painting, just a picture painted on the canvas. Did you ever see that painting, Grandmama, with the little girl in it? Oh, many times, my grandmother said. And the peculiar thing was that little Slovak kept changing her position in the picture. One day, she would actually be inside the farmhouse, and you could see her face looking out of the window. Another day, she would be far over to the left with a duck in her arms. Did you see her moving in the picture, Grandmama? Nobody did, wherever she was. Whether outside feeding the ducks or inside looking out the window, she was always motionless, just a figure painted in oils. It was all very odd, my grandmother said. Very odd indeed. And what was most odd of all was that as the years went by, she kept growing older in the picture. In 10 years, the small girl had become a young woman. In 30 years, she was middle aged. Then all at once, 54 years after it all happened, she disappeared from the picture altogether. You mean she died? I said, Eh, who knows? My grandmother said, Some very mysterious things going on in the world of witches. That's two you've told me about, I said. What happened to the third one? The third one was little Bridget Svenson, my grandmother said. She lived across the road up from us. One day she started growing feathers all over her body. Within a month, she had turned into a large white chicken. Her parents kept her 4 years in a pen in the garden. She even laid eggs. What color eggs? I said. Brown ones, my grandmother said. Biggest eggs I've ever seen in my life. Her mother made omelets out of them. Delicious they were. I gazed up at my grandmother, who sat there like some ancient queen on her throne. Her eyes were misty gray, and they seemed to be looking at something many miles away. The cigar was the only real thing about her at that moment, and the smoke it made billowed around her head in blue clouds. But the little girl who became a chicken didn't disappear, I said. Oh, no, not Bridget. She lived on for many years, laying her brown eggs. You said all of them disappeared. I made a mistake, my grandmother said. I am getting old. I can't remember everything. What happened to the fourth child? I asked. The fourth was a boy called Harold, my grandmother said. One morning his skin went all grayish yellow. Then it became hard and crackly like the shell of a nut. By evening, the boy had turned to stone. Stone? I said, You mean real stone? Granite, she said. I'll take you to see him, if you like. They still keep him in the house. He stands in the hall, a little stone statue. Visitors lean their umbrellas up against him. Although I was very young, I was not prepared to believe everything my grandmother told me, and yet she spoke with such conviction, with such utter seriousness, and with never a smile on her face or a twinkle in her eye, that I found myself beginning to wonder. Go on, Grandmama, I said. You told me there were 5 children altogether. What happened to the last one? Would you like a puff of my cigar? She said. I'm only 7, Grandmama. I don't care what age you are, she said. You'll never catch a cold if you smoke cigars. What about number 5, Grandmama? Number 5, she said, chewing the end of her cigar as if it were delicious asparagus, was a rather interesting case. A 9-year-old boy called Leaf was summer holidaying with his family on the fort and the whole family was picnicking and swimming off some rocks on one of those little islands. Young Leaf dived into the water, and his father, who was watching him, noticed that he stayed under for an unusually long time. When he came to the surface at last, he wasn't Leaf anymore. What was he, Grandmama? He was a porpoise. He wasn't. He couldn't have been. Oh, he was a lovely young porpoise, she said, and as friendly as could be. Grandmama, I said, yes, my darling. Did he really and truly turn into a porpoise? Absolutely, she said. I know his mother well. She told me all about it. She told me how Leaf the porpoise stayed with them all that afternoon, giving his brothers and sisters rides on his back. They had a wonderful time. Then he waved a flip at them and swam away, never to be seen again. But, Grandmama, I said, how did he know that the porpoise was actually Leaf? Well, he talked to them, my grandmother said. He laughed and joked with them all the time he was giving them rides. But wasn't there a most tremendous fuss when this happened? I asked. Not much, my grandmother said. You must remember that here in Norway, we are used to that sort of thing. There are witches everywhere. There's probably one living on our street this very moment. It's time you went to bed. Witch wouldn't come in through my window in the night, would she? I asked, quaking a little. Oh, no, my grandmother said. A witch would never do silly things like climbing up drain pipes or breaking into people's houses. You'll be quite safe in your bed. Come along, I'll tuck you in. And that is the end of chapter 2. So just kind of go over a couple things real quick. A porpoise, I know some of my students don't know what a porpoise is. A porpoise is a dolphin. It's another name for dolphin or different species of dolphins. And as we see in this chapter, we just get more information about witches. You might be able to describe what happened to a couple of them. Leaf was the porpoise. So things happened to Birgit, came the chicken, things of that nature. Also remember that in Norway, people are used to witches doing things like that to their children. So even though they're sad and it's heartbreaking, they're not unaccustomed to it. So they're used to it. So they don't make a huge fuss about it. It's just like, it's almost like a natural disaster. Like, something like this happened. It's really sad. But they don't make a huge deal out of it. So that's why when these things happen in Norway, it's sad, but no one makes a big deal. It doesn't become national news. So, and that is why. So we get a little more information about the narrator's grandmother and how knowledgeable she is of witches. So, all right, come back here for chapter 3. Y'all have a good day. Take care. Be good. Peace.